it's actually our first meeting, but it's definitely our first online Zoom meeting. And I think it's one of our biggest. It will be by the end. We've got 175 people booked to be part of this, which is incredible. I'm Melissa Benn, and I'll be chairing this for the night. Well, it's only for an hour, don't worry, you won't have us the whole night. And we're discussing what next after Corona, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, we have a brilliant lineup of speakers. We've got 5 people who are going to address different aspects of what has been this unprecedented crisis. So I'm going to ask each speaker, I'm going to introduce them briefly, they're going to talk for 5 minutes. If you, as the audience, want to put questions into the chat function, for those of you who are Zoom knowledgeable, you'll know how to do that. For others, go to your chat, press on the chat thing, and up will come instructions, and you put the questions to everyone, and we will choose the best questions. So after the speakers, we'll then have, I hope, 20 minutes of putting questions to them, then replying, and then at 10:02, we'll ask everybody who's speaking to come back with a pithy final set of comments, and we will finish at 8 on the dot. And as I've said already, this session will be recorded. So let's go straight to our first speaker, which, to use the greatest cliche of all time, he needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him. So it's Ed Miliband, former leader of the Labour Party, more recently co-presenter of a brilliant and incredibly popular podcast, Reasons to be Cheerful, and recently appointed Labour's shadow business secretary. So Ed, over to you. What's your take on what's likely to happen next and what we should do about it?
Thanks so much, Melissa, and I am delighted to be joining you here. I am proudly a Melissa Bennite, and so when Melissa made this invitation to me, I thought it was irresistible, and it's great to have the chance to have this conversation. 5 minutes is hard to sum up this current situation. I think my basic pitch is these moments of reassessment of what kind of society we are, what kind of economy we are, come along rarely, and it's essential that we learn the lessons of this crisis and what led up to this crisis in a deep and profound sense. And I think it's sort of interesting that this crisis has shone a light on what's wrong with our society, who has power, who doesn't, who are essential workers, how are they rewarded, what's the public realm, what's happened to our public realm. It's shone a light on what's wrong. It's also reminded us what really matters, not least, who's kept the country going, what it showed us about, sort of say, air quality, nature, all of those things that in a sense we either took for granted or were in disrepair. And I think it's also it's been tragic and awful. And yet at the same time, we've discovered, I think, a sort of spirit of solidarity, or rediscovered a spirit of solidarity, which I think is incredibly important that we shouldn't lose. So in a sense, that's my sort of framing. And I think what we can't do is say, we've been through this terrible crisis, let's just rebuild the old economy, the old society, unfair, unequal, and unsustainable as it was. And that takes me to sort of, if you like, my brief. I'm the business and energy or climate shadow secretary. And look, I think there is an imperative in this moment to build a green recovery. Why is there that imperative? Because we know that we've got to follow the science. If coronavirus has taught us one thing, it's following the science, and we know what the science is telling us about the climate emergency. We owe a duty to those who have suffered and to ourselves in this crisis to build back better. And we know in the economic emergency we face that one of the best things we can do is invest in climate, in combating climate change and in nature. And the number of jobs there are to be done across our economy, whether it is planting trees, building green spaces, changing our towns and cities for cycling and walking, insulating homes so you cut people's bills and cut carbon emissions, changing the way we heat our homes, building zero carbon engines of the future. There's so much work to be done. And the way I often think about this is, you know, what would Roosevelt do? What would Franklin Roosevelt do? And in the 30s, actually, Roosevelt was very much ahead of his time in some respects. Roosevelt put 3 million people back to work in what he called the Civilian Conservation Corps, doing a lot of these things. They planted 218 million trees. I'm afraid they built 8,000 airports and airfields, which we shouldn't be doing. And I'm afraid it was only men, so he was not ahead of his time in that respect. But I think there is a real lesson there about boldness and scale of ambition. And, you know, we've got something where between 8 to 10 million people on the furlough at the moment. I mean, that is hidden unemployment. And we've got, personally, I think we should be doing more to kind of make sure the furlough doesn't just cut off suddenly. But we've also got a duty to put people back to work and give people the useful work that we know needs to be done. The thing I'll end on is this, which is, we often think when we talk about the climate emergency, about the emergency and about the nightmare. But I sometimes say that Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare, he said, I have a dream. And I actually think part of this, whether it is about the climate emergency or about what we've gone through with coronavirus, is saying, look, this is a way of ensuring and offering people better lives and a better vision of the future. And I think by investing properly in a green recovery, I think that's what we can do.
That's brilliant, Ed. Thank you so much. And your comment about Roosevelt and having only men doesn't apply to tonight, as you're the only man speaking tonight. So that's good. But please, please stay with us, because I have questions I'd like to ask you, but I know that others will, because, you know, there are many things come out of what you said. Now let's go to our next speaker, who is Christine Berry, who's an author and researcher, generally based in Manchester, actually coming to us, I think, from East Yorkshire tonight, who's been described as one of the central figures in the New Left economics. And her work focuses on how we can build a new economic and political settlement, some of what Ed's been talking about, and replace neoliberalism. So she is the co-author with Joe Guinan, I think that's pronounced right, of People Get Ready, published by All Books in 2019. Welcome, Christine. Please tell us what you think is likely to happen or should happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I think Ed's absolutely right that we're at a real crossroads right now with this crisis, right? And you know, Naomi Klein says that with crises like this, they can sort of go either way. I think especially after 2008, there's this idea on the left that crises can be moments of opportunity for big change. But you know, as Naomi Klein says, they can also be moments where we see a sort of disaster capitalist intensification of the status quo, with people kind of trying to capitalize on this sense of disorientation and chaos. And I think there is a real danger of that right now. So that's what's at stake, I think. I think at the very least, what we're likely to see without some kind of major intervention to change course from the left is a recovery that intensifies and exacerbates existing imbalances of wealth and power. So this is the argument I made in some work I did recently for IPPR, that the way the Tories have intervened to prop up the economy is disproportionately protecting what we call rentier income, rentier capital, so people like banks and landlords, whilst actually still asking ordinary working people, particularly the low paid, particularly private renters, to take significant financial hit, and in many cases to go into debt. And I think particularly, you know, with the way that the government's mismanaged the crisis, there's going to be no fast route out of that. We are probably going to see mass unemployment, mass evictions, and we will see people on the far right trying to use that to, you know, scapegoat minorities, to scapegoat immigrants, to turn people against outsiders. And I think it's really clear as well at the moment that the Tories don't seem to have a plan of the kind that Ed just set out, which I agree is really needed. You know, this kind of Rishi Sunak shop for Britain stuff, like their main plan seems to be to resurrect the status quo as fast as possible by kind of getting a recovery going that's driven by consumer spending, household debt, all the aspects of our economic model that made us so vulnerable to this crisis in the first place. So that's the threat. That's what I think is at stake. I think the opportunity is that people kind of realised that it doesn't have to be this way. You know, as Ed said, I think this crisis is a very teachable moment in a way that the 2008 crisis wasn't quite, in that it has exposed in a very, very real, tangible, immediate way for a lot of people what's wrong with our economic system. And one way I think it's done that, that I think would be really fruitful for us to focus on, is the importance of social security, actually, which is a concept that has been very deliberately discredited over many years in this country. But I think people are now realizing that, you know, if people who are sick can't afford to stay off work, it affects everybody. You know, if people get laid off and can't afford to live, it affects everybody. And that's why I think that things like the idea of a minimum income guarantee is actually quite a smart demand at the moment, because it not only speaks to something that's deeply necessary right now, because we know that millions of people are being left behind by the support schemes that are in place and are going to struggle financially, but it also kind of asserts and rehabilitates that principle of social security, that we all have a right to a basic, decent standard of living that no one should be allowed to fall below. And I think, you know, the Tories have kind of accepted that it doesn't have to be this way, in the fact that they are borrowing huge sums of money to finance furlough, you know, this rhetoric of whatever it takes. You know, I think they are desperately backpedaling away from that now as fast as they can. And I think actually that's really what the easing of lockdown is about, much more than saving the economy, because it's not going to save the economy. It's about getting the government back off the hook. But they've kind of destroyed that spectre of there is no alternative, which is one of the main things that has propped up the status quo for so long. No, it turns out that there is a magic money tree, actually, when things get really bad in a country with its own central bank that borrows in its own currency. There is a magic money tree, and they're making use of it. So I think in that context, Ed's absolutely right. We need to think big and we need to think bold, and that means a recovery where we try and democratise wealth and power. So I think it's actually not beyond the bounds of possibility that the Tories might do something that they might at least package as a green stimulus or job creation scheme. I think what we can confidently predict that they won't do is fundamentally alter the power relations in our economy. So it's not good enough, I think, just to throw taxpayers' money at existing for-profit private companies. You know, under the sort of shareholder capitalist model that we have, I think we need to think about ownership of wealth in our economy, you know, whether that's demanding that the state takes on assets as well as liabilities. So Edinburgh Council, I think, is considering buying up empty properties at the low prices that they're at to house the homeless, for example. Commonwealth have suggested that we should have a state vehicle to buy up distressed companies and then refloat them under worker ownership models when the environment improves. We still own RBS. We could turn it into a proper public interest bank. You know, I think these are some of the kind of bold solutions that we need to be advocating, because Ed's right, you know, these are times where really anything is possible. And I think we have to be correspondingly bold in what we're imagining is possible and what we're demanding.
Thank you, Christine. That's absolutely brilliant. And it was brilliant, you following on from Ed and being even more radical in your suggestions, if you won't mind me saying that. So our next speaker, Anita, are you there, Anita? Yes. So it's Anita Whittaker, who's an award-winning mentor, business entrepreneur, community activist and consultant, school governor and political podcaster. She lives local to all of us who set up this group in Harlesden, North London, West London, and her blog is called Only Boys and Tomboys. Welcome, Anita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Racism in the UK is a very real issue. The Black Lives Matter movement that has been catapulted into the news worldwide through America is a movement that I have, with all my heart, believe in the slogan. I am not a part of the organization in America, but I am part of a group, a local group, who set up Brent Black Lives Matter here in Harlesden and are looking at local issues. Now, for the BAME community as a whole, the effects of COVID-19 have been devastating. Deaths in the BAME community is disproportionate to their percentage of the population. Here in Brent, we had the highest number of COVID-19 deaths in the UK. It's no coincidence that Brent is also the second most diverse borough in the UK, with 65% of the population from BAME backgrounds. Nationally, 18% of care, leisure and other occupations, as described in the Ethnicity Facts and Figures service on gov.uk, are black. One of the things that I want to highlight is the fact that Black Lives Matter is a black issue, not a wider, broader BAME issue, okay? When murmurs of surprise and questions were asked in Parliament and the media as to why BAME deaths were so high, we in the black community shouted at our frustrations from our homes. It was no surprise to my uncle, who was amongst the national figure of 5% of black managers and senior officials, a senior manager at an NHS hospital, who has been speaking out, trying to support his colleagues, those frightened and distraught over the tragic loss of their colleagues and peers. A man whose opinions and fight for equality were and are being ignored. It was no surprise to the 500 plus young people who attended a block party in Harlesden during lockdown, causing a media backlash, those who have been subjected to disproportionate levels of stop and search and receiving more fines for breaking lockdown rules than any other race, being left to hash out frustrations on social media, which has been a proven cause in the rise of online bullying and gang warfare. Those who have been statistically failing nationally with no real effort on the part of government to make tangible changes. It was no surprise to my son, a bright 17-year-old A-level student who is aware that although larger numbers of black students are being accepted into universities as a whole, the top universities have a long way to go and the attainment gap is inexcusably large, with the pathway to work after receiving a degree biased. It's no surprise to the Windrush generation, my grandmother, who came from Barbados in the early 1950s and worked as a nurse for over 40 years. A generation and its unappreciated descendants who made headline news over the past year battling deportation. My grandmother's colleagues, peers, elderly people placed in detention centres waiting to be sneaked onto a plane. Those same British citizens who were then asked to come out of retirement to support the NHS, just like they were invited to come here and build British infrastructure after World War I. COVID-19 has highlighted the ongoing issues that sadly are no surprise to the black community. Without it, would the world have had time to watch the murder of George Floyd? Many atrocities against the black community have been spoken of, campaigned against and fought over, but this time the world was still enough to pay attention. Black Lives Matter to me is a heartfelt plea. My 4 sons matter. My husband, brother, father, grandparents, uncles, aunts matter. I matter. The systems need to change. They need to change throughout the decade. They needed to change throughout the decades in the 50s at the death of Kelso Cochrane, the 60s with the Bristol bus boycott, the fight for recognition and equality in the 70s, the 80s New Cross 13, the 90s Stephen Lawrence, and most recently the wrongly imprisoned and deported generation who have tirelessly worked to build and support a system that failed them and continues to do so with no remorse. The biased language of the media vilifying black community, perpetrating fear and negative stereotype into the minds of British people. When the lockdown is lifted and there is a scramble for jobs during the upcoming economic depression, will we still be heard? Will the eradication of racial bias and the importance of inequality and the importance of equality still be relevant, or will the systems remain and the support disappear? We all have a role to play in ensuring racism and systemic racism is stamped out. Now is the time to change. Now, I wrote it because there were so many issues that affect the black community that covers what all my fellow panelists are saying. So I apologize for having to read that out, but I wanted to make sure that all the points were covered. Racism has been here for a long time. These are the issues we've been dealing with before COVID, noticeably during COVID, and what will happen next.
Right. Anita, thank you. That was incredibly powerful. It really was. Thank you. And please stay as all the speakers so that we can, I think people will want to ask questions. So just moving on to our next speaker, Hilary Cottam, briefly to introduce her. Hilary is an acclaimed author, innovator and change maker. She combines new thinking with radical concrete practice. Hilary started Participle in 2006, a 10-year experiment in developing new models of welfare in collaboration with communities and local government across Britain. And her latest book, published by Virago Little Brown, is Radical Help. Welcome to Hilary, and look forward to hearing from you. I can't see you right now, but I know you're there.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me. I'm here in Peckham, so it's an honour to join you in North London, and also to go after Anita. That was so powerful. So as you mentioned, Melissa, I spent the last decade working out of a small room in South London, building new forms of welfare with communities across Britain, and we built different forms of family support for young people, looking at different ways to approach not only kind of getting work, but progressing into good work, looking at the challenges of chronic disease and ageing. And all the models that were generated in this very participative way had kind of care and connection at their heart. And they were used by over 10,000 people. And one of the things I talk about in Radical Help was that everywhere I went saying, you know, that we've got this great sort of alternative form of support for older people, let's say, local leaders would say, oh, well, it looks really good, we're sure it'll save us money. But the thing is, people will never participate here. And so I think that is what is so profound, and Ed talked about this, about what we've seen over the last months, is that people will participate here, by which I mean not just here in Peckham or, you know, in Handsworth, like everywhere, in every street and every village, people have spontaneously organised, you know, whether it's to make sure that there's kind of a, you know, good iftar during Ramadan, medicines are delivered, you know, making masks, whatever it is, people have got together, which I think is so important. So I think the biggest threat, obviously, is that we might return to normal, and that we might miss this opportunity to really recreate our social systems. And when we think about social systems, I guess there are two risks. I mean, one risk is, you know, that we go back to some kind of austerity idea. But for me, actually, just as big a risk is that there is some investment, and it goes into these 1950s systems which aren't serving us properly today and aren't rising to problems that we face, and are kind of helping some people, but at the expense of other people and other bodies that we often can't see. And there's a big race story in there as well, which is something kind of in Radical Help. So, you know, our systems aren't universal, and people are excluded in all kinds of different ways. And obviously this pandemic has kind of not really exposed the inequalities. I still think not to everybody. I'm still part of conversations where I think it's quite surprising what people can see and what they can't see. But also it's really exposed, and again, Ed talked about this, it's exposed the way that social and economic and ecological challenges are so interwoven. And so I suppose one of the things is this going to be like a 1914 moment where we just kind of, you know, fiddle a bit and wait for a greater catastrophe? Or is it going to be the 1945 moment where we really go for a revolutionary redesign? And I think that we've seen, I mean, it has been an incredible time of loss and sorrow. And I think also it's really important that our leaders haven't been able to talk about that. But I think that we've seen two really important things in terms of the kind of social conversation. So one is that centralised systems have really failed us. And actually, perhaps controversially in current company, I would say that it's quite interesting that we've seen this lionisation of the NHS, because actually the NHS has really failed. These centralised systems have not worked. You know, problems have been loaded onto care homes. What we've seen is incredible people within these systems working against all the odds to make sure, even though they didn't have kind of PPE and everything else, that they took care of us. And we've seen, you know, as I've said, that sort of local systems can actually do things much more powerfully. And then we've also seen, I think, that yes, well, to that same point, we've seen this kind of local participation, and we've also seen that the local state can work in a really powerful way. So, you know, with places that I work with all across the country, Barrow, East Ayrshire, we've seen this profound way in which the local state has kind of basically chucked off its lanyards and got going to work in a really horizontal, out of the silo way, which I think is really exciting. So I don't think we can expect this kind of to last. You know, we're not going to see all the kind of social infrastructure that's mushroomed stay forever. But I do think what we've seen is a completely different way that we could organise things. So I thought, I mean, I can't remember, have I got sort of a couple of minutes left, Melissa? I can't.
Yeah, you've got about, yes, about a minute and a half to be.
Okay, so I mean, I think just I would lay out that, you know, there's some really important places we should go. So one is care. You know, we've had so many inquiries, so little action, and one of those things is because I think in people's minds they've been thinking, how do we organise a kind of sibling 1950s system for care that looks like the NHS? And now what we've seen is we don't need that. What we need is support for local horizontal systems that build off everything we've seen happen in this pandemic. Another thing is work. You know, right before the pandemic struck, I was running workshops across the country looking at what does a good working life look like, and I was working with grave diggers and carers and nuclear weapon makers, digital artisans, all kinds of different people. And what was really kind of, no matter what walk of life people came from, what they were experiencing was insecurity and precarity and a complete lack of faith actually in the institutions we've got. So I think that this is a place where we have to really think differently about the kind of hours of work, the conditions of work, and also kind of what, I mean, I would really be arguing for a transition income to really think powerfully about a lot of the well-paid good work in this country is dirty work in the kind of, you know, context of the work that Ed's got to do in terms of a Green New Deal and a green economy. So we've really got to think differently, and we can use this moment. Universities are empty because of, you know, we're not going to have foreign students. We can, you know, work on what Christine's saying, kind of, invest that same money that is flowing in sorts of incomes that can move and support people to move from one industry to another. So I think that would be really, really important. And then the last thing that I want to say that is kind of core to the work that I'm doing now is I really think that the other opportunity that is so important at the local level is to begin to reconnect local social systems to the local economy. So for too long what we've expected is that there will be no local economy, and that somehow the welfare state, even though we've taken out all the money, will prop people up without a local economy. And then we ask, you know, why those services don't work and why our school children are stressed and so on. So we've absolutely got to reintegrate new economic and social systems, and I think we can see so much experimentation out there that we can build on, and that it is a kind of huge moment of opportunity.
Thank you, Hilary. There's so many ideas. Everybody is packed into their 5 minutes and also been so disciplined. I'm really impressed. So our final speaker is coming to us from Australia, Lizzie O'Shea. It's 6 o'clock in the morning there, I think. So I think she needs a Oh, you're looking great.
Thank you.
I thought you might be in your pajamas, but anyway, you're dressed as well. So you describe yourself, I like this, as lawyer to the people, writer, a union delegate, and you are also the author of Future Histories, published by Verso in last year, which I think has got a fantastic subtitle. It is What Ada Lovelace, Tom Paine and the Paris Commune Can Teach Us About Digital Technology. So Lizzie, let's hear your arguments about our future, particularly our digital future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to join you from very, very South London is probably like how I'd like to think of it. So I think Arundhati Roy was correct in how she framed this particular moment. She talked about treating the pandemic as a portal into a new world, and we have to use this particular opportunity to think about what we'd like to take from the past with us to the future, and what we also might like to leave behind. And digital technology is obviously something that's close to my heart as the chair of a digital rights organisation, as a writer on these topics. So it seemed like the right thing to talk about that issue specifically, given the great coverage by other speakers in very powerful and profound ways of other topics of interest. And I think the biggest threat of this virus is that the government will use and continue to develop a culture of surveillance associated with technology. And it was clear early on, I think, in the crisis that technology would have a role to play, and I think it still does have a role to play. But a really ugly aspect of the pandemic has been the attempt to solidify this idea that we have a social duty to tolerate invasions of privacy and other human rights for the sake of public health and safety. And this has taken the form of requiring many people around the world to download contact tracing apps in their phone, with few privacy protections, and also experimentations with facial recognition technology in public places for the purposes of things like temperature checks to avoid the spread of the virus. And I think it's important to acknowledge as well, of course, that this culture already exists, that routinely policy making in this space on tech issues uses the cover of risks to health and safety in order to justify a rebalancing of power away from people towards the government. And this is often facilitated with bad faith media coverage, industry cheerleaders, and often a weak political opposition. And we need to find ways to change that mode of operating, which has been so rewarding for politicians who are in this space. And the answer to that, in my view, is that we need to build movements that force policymakers to feel they're responsible for the decisions they make, and that they're at risk when they make decisions that aren't in the interests of the public. And so while I think it's obviously a moment of alarm for digital rights activists, there's also something very positive about this moment in that people are starting to reject this mode of political operating. They're refusing to accept this kind of political bargain where we must all give up privacy and autonomy for public safety. And the experience of COVID, I think, demonstrates how privacy and public health actually go together, that governments need to earn a social license in order to use technology in particular ways in order for them to be effective. And I think that's a good thing. So the example here in Australia, and I feel like we're about 9 or 11 hours ahead of you, but also we're a few months ahead of you in terms of developing a contact tracing app. We've had one that's been deployed since, or for about 6 or 7 weeks now. And it was widely promoted as pretty much our only way out of lockdown. It was compared to sunscreen or a vaccine in very dangerous terms, I think. And early proposals, I think it's worth acknowledging as well, mooted the idea of experimenting with a broader system of digital identity. So linking up this app potentially with your healthcare, access to healthcare, access to welfare, things like your driver's license. So a very ambitious program of essentially developing an idea of digital identity that could be used for surveillance and management rather than poverty alleviation when it comes to people who are disadvantaged, which I think was deeply alarming. But of course, what happened was very few people downloaded the app, which is a phenomenon that's also happened in other places around the world, including places like Singapore and Iceland. Not enough people downloaded it because there's a deficit of public trust. And similarly, I think the UK's experimentation with contact tracing technology has faced similar hurdles, a lot of public distrust and concern about how this information will be used, which then leads to an ultimate potential failure of the technology itself. And I think a big reason is this deficit of public trust, that it's no longer possible for policymakers to treat human rights as an afterthought in tech initiatives, or to dismiss privacy issues as concerns that are only held by people who wear tinfoil hats. And I pointed to myself there, but I don't actually consider myself a tinfoil hat wearer. I think it's clear that lots of people are worried about these issues, and the government needs to work hard to fix it wherever they are. And it comes in the context of a wave of protests around police violence and police brutality that Anita was talking about before. And I think these protests provide a very good example as to why people might be skeptical of giving over data to government, of downloading technology that can trace who they've been in contact with, or see which public spaces they've occupied and who they've been there with, because it's a very short distance between using this technology for health and safety to using this technology to quash dissent. And I think that's a living example of why people might be concerned about this and the very urgent need for government to work hard to develop public trust. So if we're to do this, the government needs to do the right thing. It needs to stop constantly violating our privacy and start talking about how it's committed to protecting it. But I also think we need to start building technology that is designed in ways that are decentralized, that are open source, that prioritize accountability. We need to bake these ideas into the design process rather than patch them on later when the opportunity to gain public trust has already been squandered. And if we can't offer those kinds of protections, maybe we need to consider a moratorium. And I think it's very interesting that in recent days, IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft have all drawn this conclusion themselves in relation to facial recognition technology and are no longer selling it to law enforcement. And I think we should consider whether we want a moratorium in lots of other settings as well, and why we might be able to take this demand a bit further. So I do think technology definitely has a role to play in stopping the spread of the virus, but I think this moment has presented a clear example of why prioritising privacy and other kinds of human rights in the online world is not counterposed to the success of these projects, that in fact cultivating a culture of privacy and respect for human rights will be the only way that we can make use of these technologies effectively. And this really is the moment to agitate and organise around these issues, because there's so many clear examples of why these ideas aren't just true in theory, they're true in practice. So if a a pandemic is a portal, I'd like to leave behind the culture whereby we're encouraged to treat privacy as something that we need to give up for public health and safety. And I'd like to take with us the idea that we should always be questioning governments and companies when they deploy technology nominally in the public interest, because that's not a sign of paranoia or naysaying, that's a sign of a healthy democracy.
Right, Lizzie, thank you so much. And that's actually a very sort of cheerful thought. And I think we'll come back to that. Now, look, amazingly disciplined speakers. We do have time for a number of questions, and I have a number of them up here. So the first one I'm going to address to Ed, and maybe Christine could answer it as well, which is, so bear with me, it's from Jane Hyde, who is one of, obviously a participant. And it's, can we really, Ed, can you hear me? So it's, can we really address the climate emergency when there's so much emphasis on economic growth, or GDP as the key measure of economic success? And I would have thought presumably post-crisis as well. So perhaps could you have a brief go at that, and then perhaps Christine could as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the answer is no. I mean, GDP growth cannot be our ultimate measure of the success of our societies. Bobby Kennedy, the American politician, said 50 years ago, I just happen to actually have it here, gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play, the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, the integrity of our public officials, and much else besides. And we haven't acted on that insight. And what's wrong with GDP? Clearly, in the era of the climate emergency, it tells you nothing. Indeed, it can tell you perverse things about whether you're tackling that climate emergency. Somebody said in the chat that they liked Kate Raworth's donut economics framework, and I tend to agree. I think it is a good framework. I think even on its own terms, GDP doesn't tell you anything about the distribution of wealth and income. And so GDP in the United States and Britain seem to be going up for the last few decades, but actually it didn't tell you who was getting the wealth and income. So the answer is yes. Now then there's the question of sort of degrowth. And look, the way I think about this is there are lots of jobs to be done to get us to a net zero world. Now, they might they will incidentally contribute to economic growth. That doesn't mean we're doing them because we want GDP, we want because of the measure of GDP. But, you know, I think sort of those jobs need doing. And so I sort of tend to think that, and so Kate really says this in her book, and I've talked to Kate about this, that in a way, I think it's not about sort of fetishizing growth or degrowth, but it's about saying, how do you move to a world that respects planetary boundaries? And so that's the kind of way I tend to think about it.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to ask Christine if she wants to add something to that. There's more questions for you, Ed, and I've actually got a pressing one myself, which I hope to get in. Christine, do you want to respond to that again briefly? We need to unmute you.
Yeah, you've unmuted me now.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I basically agree with what Ed said. I do think one of the things that has really been exposed by the recent phase of the crisis in particular is the way that the structure of our economy and the needs of our economy are misaligned with people's actual needs and people's priorities, which I think is why when you saw the first phase of the government easing lockdown, and this kind of ruthless prioritization of getting money circulating again, getting GDP going back up again, and basically allowing activities where money changed hands. So you could let a cleaner into your home, but you couldn't let your mother into your home. And people were sort of seeing this as a complete nonsense. Like, oh, well, I'll just bung my mum a fiver to come and clean my house and then she can visit me, you know. And I think that was because it seemed ridiculous to people because it was really exposing this gulf between the demands that our economic system places on us and the things that we really value. And I do think that is one of the respects in which this crisis needs to be a teachable moment, and we have to actually reflect on that and on the kind of economic system that we're building going forward. And I actually think that is deeper than just whether we're focusing on GDP or measuring GDP. It's also about the fact that we have got this economic system that is dependent on growth. You know, it's a bit like a bicycle, it has to keep moving, otherwise it falls over. And that's why the government is so desperate to get the economy growing again. But as Ed said, you know, that doesn't tell you anything about who benefits from that growth. And we know that probably the benefits of that growth are not going to flow to the people that are struggling the most currently, probably through the pandemic. And it doesn't tell you anything about the kinds of activity that you're encouraging. So again, it's this Sunak kind of shop for Britain, get out and buy stuff, like even if it's useless, because we need to get GDP growing again. And you know, this is another reason that I think getting to grips with these arguments about rentier power and ownership is actually really important, because there's someone I know called Beth Stratford whose work I would really recommend, and she's been basically looking into the idea that our economy's dependence on growth is partly a result of the monopolization of resources that we need by rentiers that can charge us to use them. It's kind of quite a complicated economic argument, so I don't have time to do justice to, but I think it's a really fascinating one, that actually by democratizing ownership of these things and democratizing wealth, we can reduce our economy's dependence on continually expanding and growing in order to keep everybody's basic needs met. That's probably more than enough for me. But.
No, that's great. That's absolutely great. It's just we've got other questions. So a sort of slightly different question now to Anita, which is, Anita, what one thing, I mean, it's bringing it back to the pragmatic and the now, what one thing could MPs do to improve the lives of the Black community in Britain now? What would you like to see them do? And again, if you could keep your answer brief, sorry to keep saying this.
First, one thing. I think there.
Things quickly you can, but really just yeah.
I do think the one thing that they can do is to accept that they don't have an understanding and truly find support from the Black community. There are leaders, there are speakers, there are historians that can truly support. I do know that the Home Office has employed a historian to help with understanding and helping to teach their staff and senior members of their immigration on understanding different people's perspectives and where they're coming from. Unfortunately, again, still it's a white middle-class man who studied in Cambridge. When they do have people of colour, they've got BAME senior members of staff within this service to be able to tap into. So I would like the government to start truly looking at honestly who they actually have, and if they don't have somebody there, to get people in that actually know how to support them and admit that they don't know what they're doing.
Right, okay, I like that. I think that's a good political answer, for them to admit that they know nothing. That's good. And I bet Ed, being the one politician on the call, unless there are loads of other MPs who are listening to us, would agree with that, actually. So I have got another question for Hilary and Ed together, but I'm first of all going to ask a sort of similar question to Lizzie that's come in. I'm sorry, I haven't got names attached to all of these because they're being sent to me from the chat. But Lizzie, again, can you briefly give us an idea of how you could persuade the mass of people that surveillance is dangerous, rather than opinion formers or a group who might know the arguments? How if you had to do that, through channels of, through the public, how would you do that? And again, a short and sweet answer, please.
Yeah, well, I think when we talk about digital rights issues and surveillance particularly, it's often treated as a niche issue that's relevant really to people like whistleblowers and journalists, and often that's how it's framed and the discussion happens, partly because I think the media doesn't always do a good job around this, which is work on our part as civil society advocates. But I actually think talking with many more different civil society organisations and bringing them into the fold and different kinds of communities to understand lots of issues as being digital rights issues rather than just the technology behind these particular projects. I mean, we've talked a little bit about welfare, and there's some great work on this issue, but the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty last year released a report around the digitisation of the welfare state and how dangerous it was, and he was talking a bit about some of these ideas around digital identity, that in fact privacy is not just an issue for whistleblowers and people of interest to national security agencies. It's actually an issue for anyone who comes into contact with the state through health services or welfare services, because this becomes a system of surveillance and management rather than alleviation of poverty. And I think talking about privacy not as a tech issue, but as an issue that relates to everybody in their different ways across the full spectrum of civil society, so everybody from healthcare users to people who might be supporting survivors of domestic violence, for example, as well as people organising around racial justice, it becomes an issue that's much more mainstream and widespread. And I think the basis is there. People increasingly are rejecting these technologies. So they're interested, they've got a deficit of public trust in the government for this reason, and the government's now having to work hard to restore that. That's the perfect basis to start organising and agitating around these issues. So I think it's an opportunity for us as organisers and agitators to take that up, and I wouldn't want to lose this opportunity, because I think it's a really critically important one.
Yeah, so actually this crisis provides that opportunity to do the very thing that I said. Okay, so now I have a question for Hilary and Ed, and perhaps Hilary could answer it first, which is from somebody on the call who says, I run a small community support organisation in a market town, and how does the big government narrative allow for communities actually to take control? So Hilary, could you have a go at that, and then I'll ask Ed to come in.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, it's a disaster. You can't have a big government narrative and have any of the things that we are talking about. I think I've written a manifesto for a fifth social revolution, which is what I think that we need. And in that manifesto, I set out that there are 4 groups that need to play a really powerful role if we're going to make change, which is organised civil society. You know, we're going to have to take power. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement matters so much. What I call organic intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, because I don't just mean people in academia, I mean people who can tell stories and link new ideas to practice. We need what I call the new industrialists, so people who are in business and who are prepared to think differently about a social contract and their role in that. And then we need the state. And the state has to be like the head gardener. It has to kind of set out the framework in which everybody else can act. So I've seen that question about ABCD, which I'm familiar with, that the state has to kind of set out a framework that allows those kind of approaches to take root. And at the moment, I think that's really difficult, because we've got this kind of, you know, really vertically organized mass production state. I mean, we've got a particular disaster at the moment, but actually, you know, I mean, I think, you know, Ed would probably agree, because he's had a few goes at this, is that, you know, getting into power is great, but then you've got to really grapple with a state that is completely out of kilter in terms of what it needs to do to help all of us to kind of really thrive and be wealthy in the sort of Anglo-Saxon sense of richness of life, not kind of money. And so I think that this is a real challenge to kind of rethink that. I mean, one thing that might happen will be that that the local state will become like a social movement in a way, and begin to kind of grasp that power back, because I mean, it does seem like the central state is 10 years behind the local state now. And, you know, we're seeing some people like, Donna Hall, for instance, who I work with, who was the former chief executive of Wigan, really sort of having taken to social media and powerfully articulating now, you know, the things that the local state can do, whilst the government is sort of trying to ignore it and give things to kind of very big companies in these. I mean, the FT had an incredible article last weekend, which I tweeted about how many billions have passed into private sector contracts without any kind of scrutiny in the last weeks to do things that the local state actually has expertise to do in. So it's not that I'm pessimistic about what can happen, but I think we need to be realistic about what needs to happen in order for the local to thrive, and that has to be at the top of the agenda.
Okay, I would have said you were slightly pessimistic there. If I said.
Well, you know, realistic, but I mean, it is. Yes, I think anybody who's tried to make change really has a visceral understanding of the problems of the mass production state in this country and how it makes it very difficult to actually make change.
Okay, sorry, I'm just overlaying my own pessimism to your answer, excuse me. So Ed, perhaps you could answer the question, but then also relate it to what Hilary has said, and as you being one of the head gardeners or a gardener in the gardening team, or wishing to be.
I mean, look, I'm a sort of, I think Hilary's stuff is brilliant, and I was very struck that we did a live edition of my podcast. This is not intended to be a podcast plug, well, not too much, with Hilary. And
and Ed, can I just interrupt to say that you actually wore a flower garland in that podcast, if you remember? So you were really a good gardener.
True, I did. That is true. I think involuntarily, I think. But anyway.
Ed, can I interrupt just to say that the leader of Brent Council is one of the people on our call. So when you're talking about the local state, you might want to bear that in mind.
I mean, the thing I sort of think about this is that you clearly need, and this is the thing the left has never really cracked, is how, you know, we are very good at talking about the unaccountable power of the market. We are much less good about talking about the unaccountable power of the state and the relationship of the state to the citizen. Now, that is not, and Hilary and I have had this discussion a lot, and I think we agree, that is not to say you don't need the state, because
no, you do.
You do, exactly, because you know, the big society, David Cameron's so-called big society, is a sort of example of what happens when people try and say, well, you know, we don't really need the state, we're just going to sort of leave it to society in some broad sense. But having said that, I think it's Nicholas who asked the question on the chat. I think it's completely right about the challenge being, and I would say to him, in a small community support organisation in a market town, I mean, you know, I'd like a local authority like Preston, for example, that has a thing called the community wealth building, that wants to say, look, we've got to think about how do the institutions of the state actually properly interact with local people. Now, I'm not saying Preston is the whole answer, but I think there must be ways in which the state can kind of recognize its limitations and engage properly with local communities. And I think Hilary is sort of indicating that she thinks that in some local areas it is being done better, certainly better than central government. And last thing I'll say, Melissa, yeah, you know, England, the UK, yes, but also particularly England, is the most centralized country in Europe. And we're also the most unequal country in Europe. And I think the two are connected.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure that's true. So look, I've got one more question that I quickly want to put to Anita. And then I want to ask you to sum up, and I'm going to put one question to all of you when you sum up, which has really struck me in this debate. So this is from Bridget Russell. And Anita, it's how can we create spaces in which we're able to have real conversations? I mean, it applies to all our speakers, but where, says Bridget, we can share our common ground and different perspectives and value both. Does that question, it makes sense to me? Do you
yes. I can say already, we're doing it here. We're listening to each other. You guys have given me a great platform and I'm very grateful for that. The conversation is being had more often, and I do think I was in a meeting with Councillor Butt, hi Councillor Butt, leader of Brent Council, who's kindly joined on, and the council itself in Brent, I can't speak for all of the UK, but they have started to create forums that we can have conversations. There really does need to be an understanding of, there really needs to be an understanding of what's needed and a safe space to speak. For many years, I've been a person that speaks out, but I've always also kind of limited myself because I've never wanted to come across as an angry Black woman. So the saying is, you know, I spent my life being a quiet Black girl to avoid being an angry Black woman, and to start to recognize that when somebody's got something to say they're passionate about, let's not attach ourselves to stereotypes, and let's breathe, step back and actually pay attention to what somebody's saying. Another thing I want to add very quickly is also thinking about racism in this sense, that in America it's quite in your face, and over here it's quite hidden. So if we can start being honest and open, that will make a change. I can cope with somebody giving me a slap to my face because I know exactly what I'm expecting. But if somebody's having a hidden agenda and making me feel as though there's something wrong with me, you turning my mind against myself is the most dangerous thing that we can do. And that is what affects generations. So if we can all look to ourselves and be honest, take time and actually listen, then the conversation will flow.
Can I just say that our next online meeting is going to be about the politics of this, about the uprisings in America, but particularly here around George Floyd's death and the question of statues and history and social and economic conditions that could give rise to what we've seen. So that conversation will continue. And we briefly saw the leader of Brent Council on the screen, and I'm sorry that we can't bring you in because we have to stop quite soon, but we will ask you to join that next Kensal and Kilburn debate. So that's a definite, so we're waving to thumbs up. Now look, I have a final question to all the panelists, but I want you just to weave it into your answers. I've been really inspired by everything that you've said. I think you've picked up on the hope and the possibilities and the change that may be there and definitely is there and that needs to happen. But I'm also so powerfully aware that we are only a few months into a conservative government that's taken us out of Europe, celebrated that, enabled the far right to rise, has an 80-seat majority, seems to have no understanding of any of this. Of all the things that you've talked about. So I want to end on a positive note, but I want you each to give me something to answer my realism on that political point, and then perhaps to say to the audience what we can all do to promote the kind of agendas that you're talking about. So why don't we start reverse order? So Lizzie, could you perhaps answer my point, and then we'll move back and end with Ed. Are you there, Lizzie?
I am, and I too am concerned by the realism of the situation, I suppose, because in Australia we face a Conservative government as well who seems to have recovered from an absolute crisis when it came to handling bushfires to now being seen to have effectively brought us through this, although it's yet to be seen whether that's true. I mean, I think the answer is probably always going to be the same. I don't think there's a secret methodology to it. I think we need to organise, agitate and build social movements that are diverse, that bring in lots of social questions. One of the things that I think is really obvious from this discussion is that so many of these issues are interconnected. How we deal with the inadequacies of the welfare state will be affected by our approach to technology. We need to make sure we deal with the racism that's implicit in lots of British politics in order to make sure that solutions we build don't further marginalise people already on the edges. And so the kinds of social movements that will be effective will be ones that are diverse, that have lots of input into them, that take these issues not as niche ones, but are ones that overlay lots of aspects of society. And that's true regardless of who the government is. I mean, Ed may have a different view, but I think even if we had a Labor government, I think you'd still need to do that organising and agitating to give politicians the mandate and the platform and hold their feet to the fire to make sure that they do the right thing by the public, that it genuinely is a representative system rather than a system of power. We hand it over to politicians and leave them to do the work. And I think that's probably, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here.
That's great, Hilary.
Forcing those kinds of decisions to be made in favour of the public.
Great. Okay, Hilary, do you want to just add to that? I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say it's going to be
130
seconds.
So, I mean, really, I just want to kind of come back to the importance of participation. You know, obviously, kind of, you know, I'm deeply sort of imbued in the welfare state. And at the end, you know, during the Second World War, something really important happened, which was that everybody participated at home, in the trenches, and people saw that their kind of lazy ideas about how, you know, what you might be like if you were black or, you know, or white or, you know, I mean, most what happened in that situation was that people saw that their lazy stereotypes about poverty really, you know, you weren't poor because you were lazy, you were poor because the country was structurally rigged in such a way that you were poor. And that experience enabled the welfare state to happen. I mean, Beveridge pushed through the welfare state kind of, you know, in a sort of deep compact with the country, holding politicians and civil servants' feet to the fire, really. And something like that has happened now. You know, we have all joined into something, and we have had that experience of participating alongside people who are not like us. I mean, those bridging relationships are really important. And when this is over, you can't forget that. You can't forget that you did something with somebody and you now know your neighbour. And I think that that will give us something really important to build on. I mean, how long this government can possibly last, I don't know. But I also agree, you know, with Lizzie that actually, I mean, you know, power is not going to be given up. They're a rentier class. We have to use this experience of participation to mobilise now.
Okay, so that's the message. Mobilise, 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 hold their feet to the fire. Anita, do you want to add anything to that? Again, very...
Again, coming from my point, one of the things that I've loved about COVID is people's have had to stop and think and take notice. Now that we've taken notice, now that we are being heard, that makes me feel like there's hope for my children's futures. I've got 4 boys, 26 all the way down to 8 years old. And what it makes me feel is that there is hope, because a lot more people are taking control, taking notice, asking questions, educating themselves, and we can mobilize as a community, and the communities are getting stronger. And as anything that is horrendous that happens in society, something that comes out of it can be very community driven and tighter. We just have to get through this next stage. So we've already started. Let this continue. Yeah.
Okay. Christine, do you want to just tell us whether you endorse these messages of mobilise and regardless of government, quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I basically agree with everything that's been said. And I think it goes back to the conversation that Ed and Hilary were having earlier about the state, right? Because I think on the one hand, you know, as Ed said, we need the state, we need its ability to pool risk and resources. The crisis has shown how important the state can be. On the other hand, you know, we've also seen the failings of a highly centralized state, as Hilary said, things like the test and trace system. We're also seeing the politicization of issues around police brutality and racism and various kinds of oppression led by the state, you know, as Anita and Lizzie both talked about. And you know, as people have said, that just at a practical level in the short term, the state is not our friend right now because of the people that are in charge of it, right? And like I do also feel quite depressed by that. Obviously, a lot of the demands we've been talking about probably will have to wait for a change of government. Even then, might be difficult to achieve. But I think in the meantime, actually, especially after the Cummings affair, I've been thinking about this a lot, and the kind of delegitimization of this government that has led to, we almost need to start acting as though we are in a failed state, I think, on the left. And if we want to start to chart a better route out of the crisis, it needs to be led by, you know, local authorities, social movements, civil society, stepping into that leadership vacuum that the state has created, and working together to try and chart that new path forward ourselves.
Okay, that's great. Well, that's great to say that with a leader of one of the biggest and most affected local authorities on the line. Okay, we're going to finish after Ed has spoken. So Ed, wrap it up for us. Give us hope, realism. Tell us why politics is still worth paying attention to, given the government we've got.
God, that's difficult. Here's a cheerful thought, which is I saw a clip from Fox News during the week which said that Black Lives Matter was now significantly more popular than Donald Trump.
Yay!
And I think that is, I think there is a significance to that, actually. The approval rating for Black Lives Matter was something like 63% of the Trump 43%. And that didn't happen because of politicians, that happened because of the movement. And I think that is the lesson. I mean, you know, look, I want the Labour government as soon as possible. And I think a Labour government would be 1,000,000 times better than this government and would do good things. But it doesn't take away the need for the activism of civil society. And then I suppose the last thing is, you know, I think this crisis is a reminder that people are basically good. Most people are basically good. And I think, you know, I do think, I don't want to overdo it, but I think there has been a different spirit that we've seen during this crisis. I sort of feel like it myself. And I think that's partly, Christine said it, that's why the reaction to Cummings was so bad. So I think there is a different spirit. Now it's the job of all of us in different ways to sort of cultivate and nurture that spirit. And then I suppose the point to end on is there's no alternative really to, you know, I mean, optimism is kind of better because pessimism just means you don't get out of bed really.
Yeah, okay, look, that's a brilliant place to end. Can I thank all our 5 inspiring speakers? I've really learned a lot tonight, and yeah, and I think it's all worked quite well. I'm quite pleased with the way it's gone. We're still all adapting to Zoom culture, but this has made me feel optimistic about Zoom culture actually. So we're going to end the meeting now. Thank you very much, and look out for our next meeting, which is going to continue on the themes of racism and Black Lives Matter and all the things that Anita was talking about. Thank you and good night.